Rishi Sunak and David Cameron are facing pressure from within cabinet to not put any conditions on arms sales to Israel. That was according to Bloomberg, who last week reported Cameron and Sunak are caught in between opposing Tory factions. The Bloomberg report said there were 3 cabinet ministers in particular who were very pro-Israel, very, very much opposed to conditioning military aid. Bloomberg didn't say who they were, but comments from former Minister Alan Duncan last week gave an indication that it could include Michael Gove and Oliver Dowden. And it was Oliver Dowden who spoke to Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday on the government's behalf. This was his answer as to whether Britain should suspend Israeli arms sales.
The kind of relish with which people are rushing towards this question without understanding the broader context. It's right to raise individual issues, but you have to see it in this wider context of the challenge that Israel faces.
It's interesting you say that. You've said twice, actually, that Israel is being held to extremely high standards. And you've just said you think some people are relishing sort of putting Israel on the spot over whether or not they're acting legally. Who do you think's relishing that? Don't you think people are just asking questions based on what they see as appalling suffering in Gaza? Who do you think is relishing it?
Well, I think this is an important point, which is that I think it's all too easy for the world to forget the horrors that Israel faced and rush back to attacking Israel and holding Israel to standards that we wouldn't remotely hold other countries to. Now, it's right that we hold Israel to those highest standards. No, because Israel is a democratic country. It's a rules-based country. It's a part of our broader Western family of nations.
Well, it's a rules-based country. Now, after the ICJ ruled that Israel is potentially committing genocide and gave them a bunch of conditions they had to abide by, a senior cabinet minister tweeted, Hague Schmeig, right? It's not really a country that's committed to the rule of law. I also love it when we're supposed to take context into account, right? So if you talk about October the 7th, you say, we have to look at the context of this, not to justify what was done, but we have to look at the context. Oh no, that's defending terrorism. Now you got this conservative on the BBC saying, oh yes, they might be killing 33,000 Palestinians. They might be on trial at the International Court of Justice, but we need to look at the context here. Suddenly context is relevant. Ash, the discussion I wanted to have here, and I think it's sort of an interesting one, is there is a divide. We talk a lot on this show about sort of divides within the left, but there is also a divide within conservatism and within the right, I think, between neoconservatives and traditional conservatives. I was actually talking to Peter Oborne about this the other day for my podcast, and he sort of thinks of himself as a Burkean conservative, where conservatism is about keeping things somewhat as they are, right? Not doing anything too hasty. And then you got a traditional conservative might be somewhat sort of habitually isolationist. Let's not get involved because it all could go very, very wrong. And then a neoconservative is almost the precise opposite, this sort of megalomaniac. We can transform the world in our image, and also very Manichaean. So sort of good versus evil. George W. Bush is probably, when people think of neoconservatives, they'll think of George W. Bush and the Bush administration. They saw the world as sort of this fight between good and evil, the evil being sort of the Islamist fundamentalists and the good being the Western countries. And that image took them to very revolutionary positions in a way, which was trying to overthrow governments here, there, and everywhere. And not just to say, because we want to protect our business interests in sort of like a more Cold War fashion, but because we want to transform them from the bottom up. And I think what we might be seeing here is a division within the Conservative Party between the neocons, especially Michael Gove. So sort of he was a big deal in policy exchange. I think he's somewhat close to the Henry Jackson Society, though I'd need to look that one up. But that sort of comes to my mind when I think about him. And then I think Oliver Dowden is sort of in that crew as well. You've got these neocons who, when they look at Israel, they see Israel West, Hamas barbarist East, and then whatever Israel does, they say, well, this is between good and evil, and the good side is Israel. And so they're more willing to do whatever Israel wants, Israel's bidding, than maybe the traditional conservatives who are a bit sort of like, well, we want to balance our interests in the Middle East.
Well, I might surprise you here because this is where Oliver Dowden is completely right. And this is where I think you're a bit mistaken in your rebuttal of what he was saying. Is Israel part of the Western family of nations? And is what Israel is doing in line with how, Western powers like the US and Britain have conducted themselves in recent decades? Well, the answer is yes. The answer is 100% yes. And when you look at the kind of language that Israel is using, referring to Palestinian prisoners in Gaza who have been reporting extensive use of torture, referring to them as unlawful combatants, that is exactly the framework that was used by America when they were talking about individuals who were detained at Guantanamo Bay and trying to explain why the rules of war pertaining to the treatment of prisoners of war didn't apply to them. So I think if you want to, look at what Israel is doing in Gaza, not simply in terms of what Israel wants to do in terms of expanding its territory and eradicating the Palestinian people from that land. If you look at it within the context of the war on terror, military practices, legal practices, these are things which have been nurturing each other for a really long time. Israel is borrowing from the war on terror playbook, and in turn, the architects of the war on terror saw Israel as essential to its interests in the region. Now, one of the things that I would say is that actually the Manichaean quality of good versus evil that was present in the war on terror, that actually was a continuation from the Cold War, because the Cold War gave America a tremendous sense of global purpose. And not just that, the Cold War was a reason to have such a, highly developed military industrial complex with defense contractors, weapons manufacturers making absolute bank. Now, after the end of the Cold War, there was, a so-called peace dividend. There were being cuts made to the Department of Defense, and America was having to think about what its new global status would be. Was it going to be backed up by aircraft carriers, or was it going to be diplomacy? And after 9/11, there was a pretext for doing a lot of things that neoconservatives had wanted to do for a very long time. So yes, there was the invasion of Afghanistan. Following on from that, of course, was the invasion of Iraq, which, very shortly after 9/11, you had senior neocons and policymakers and influential figures in Washington saying that they wanted to do. Right, the WMD stuff was padded on as a pretext, using confected and unreliable intelligence. A lot of it coming from Iraqi dissidents who were moving in those policy-making circles in Washington and in Westminster, and their real goal was to go for Iran as well. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't, after the disasters of Afghanistan and Iraq, absolutely couldn't get together the kind of buy-in or political consensus or public support for an invasion of Iran. But make no mistake, that is what many of these people wanted to do. And so when it comes to Israel and what Israel is up to, which is, one, it's seen as a kind of bulwark in this clash of civilizations between, the democratic West and the barbarous Muslim East. But also these provocative actions of Israel, such as, bombing the consulate in Damascus, the Iranian consulate. That gets many of these neocons thinking about, could this be a pretext to achieve some of those strategic objectives that they wanted to way back in 2001? And so if you define a Western family of nations not by what I think it should be defined as, which is, rule of law, international cooperation, and democracy, but by flouting international law, but coming up with legal frameworks which completely override the Geneva Convention, coming up with, good versus evil stories in order to, make essentially, millions of people in the Middle East considered fair game. If you want to construct this category of unlawful combatants, Israel is doing that and doing it very, very well. So that is where Oliver Dowden, I think, is speaking with a degree of honesty, if not candor.
I suppose to go back to sort of the point I was making before, because yes, I don't think what Israel are doing is alien to sort of Western foreign policies, but sort of the examples you were using to sort of compare to Israel were the neocons, right? So the war on terror was conducted by neocons. So I suppose I'm saying Oliver Dowden, Michael Gove, George W. Bush, these are the neocons who are sort of exceptionally ideological when it comes to foreign policy with a Manichaean vision. And then you can also have conservatives who are a bit more realist, so they're about defending the national interest, but they don't necessarily see there being this sort of huge clash of civilizations, which I think is what was sort of quite, particular potentially to the neocons. Because I think you can look at sort of governments in the West who aren't so sort of gung ho in terms of sort of getting involved and trying to completely radically transform the world. So there will be administrations that are a bit more small c conservative than Israel's current one, or George W. Bush's, or what Michael Gove or Oliver Dowden would probably like to see.
Well, also, one of the things that Western countries should have learned is that the adventurous warfare of the war on terror did not make people in Europe or America safer. I mean, one, you had like a completely heightened sense of paranoia in America, which, lasted for decades. But two, you did have terrorist attacks on European soil and on British soil, which were a direct consequence of our military activities overseas. I mean, one of the outcomes of ousting Saddam Hussein was the rise of ISIS. So I think that there has been a shift amongst other European powers away from that sort of neoconservative model. But in Westminster, there's a sort of odd political culture. There are, significant numbers of politicians, policymakers, and journalists who have never forgiven the left for being right about Iraq, never forgiven the left for it. And ultimately, what they want to do is a chance to do it all again, I think, just because they don't like the people who are telling them that was a terrible idea in the first place. And it is that petty. So I think, yes, there are these, hardcore ideologues, Oliver Dowden, Michael Gove being two of them. But I also think there is the softer outer ring of people who just never really liked anti war protesters and who would help sleepwalk the UK into another disastrous Middle Eastern intervention if they could.
I am now trying to sort of in the back of my mind desperately think of a conservative who hasn't had a sort of very interventionist foreign policy. If you can think of one, in either the US or the UK, do let us know in the comments. Otherwise, I'll be putting this out to Twitter this evening. We can, though, find you a conservative that isn't supporting Israel in any kind of gung-ho way. Fine Gael in Ireland are a centre-right party. They're currently in power in coalition with Fianna Fáil. Now, their new leader, Simon Harris, is due to become Ireland's next Taoiseach. That's after Leo Varadkar's resignation. And he said this on the weekend.
So what we've seen happen in Gaza and the actions of the Israeli government is utterly reprehensible. It's appalling and it's grotesque. We're seeing children being maimed and killed, innocent children. It is disgusting, it is despicable, and it must stop. This country, Ireland, and a government that I intend to lead will always speak truth to power, just like our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar did in the White House to President Biden only in recent weeks. There needs to be an immediate ceasefire. The attack on aid workers was particularly, in my view, callous and chilling, and we will continue to call that out. We also, as a country, stand ready to play our part in a political process that brings about a two-state solution. This country, and indeed the UK, know a lot about the importance of peace processes. This ultimately requires a political solution that delivers a two-state solution.
Ash, lots of people have been very impressed by statements from Irish politicians since October the 7th. The Irish and the Spanish are the two nations who in Europe have been most supportive of the Palestinians or resistant to, the completely out of control Israelis. Any analysis of why that might be the case? I mean, I suppose Ireland has a history of resisting colonial occupation. Spain, less so, I would have thought. What's your take?
Well, if you want a really thorough analysis of why Ireland does have this sense of affinity with the Palestinian cause, you could do a lot worse than listening to my Downstream interview with Blind Boy of Blind Boy Boat Club fame. And one of the things that he talked about is that yes, you do have this resonance, this sense of shared experience that comes from having been colonized, having been cast as the terrorists, having been cast as ungrateful, biting the hand that feeds, as being cast as, the people who cannot be partners for peace. So there are these sort of narrative resonances between the Irish experience and the Palestinian cause. But there's also some really, direct connections. So, this was the fact that Blind Boy taught me, which was Cara Delevingne's great grandfather, who founded the Black and Tans, who were, of course, just war criminals roaming around Ireland, had been in Palestine putting down the Arab Revolt, which was, absolutely bloody, nefarious business. The vision for Israel was very similar to the vision for Ulster, as I mentioned earlier on in the show. I mean, many of the people who were integral to the eventual partition plan, integral to the Balfour Declaration, even, were also integral to the, oppression and suppression of Irish political and civil rights. So I think that that's one of the reasons why it's felt so strongly. It's not just a case of, okay, narratively, there are these similarities. It's like, well, no, our history is connected by this shared personnel. Why it's the case in Spain, I couldn't tell you, but I'd be really interested to know.
I was just looking through some of the comments, suggestions as to right-wing people who might have a genuinely sort of conservative foreign policy in the sense of not wanting to, constantly throw grenades and sort of radically transform different societies. I mean, even David Davis, although I did just Google, he did vote for the Iraq War apparently. And then Crispin Blunt, who does say some pretty reasonable things on Palestine, at least. I want one who's been in power. So I want a conservative who's been in power in sort of a Western nation and hasn't been sort of radically gung-ho when it comes to foreign interventions. I suppose Jacques Chirac in France is an option. But I don't know much about him. Maybe that was specific to Iraq, and actually he was quite gung-ho elsewhere.
I've also got a controversial one.
Go on.
A really controversial one. So, Donald Trump.
Yeah, he's got some small C conservatist, realist. I'm not out to radically transform the world. We're just going to protect American interests. Don't bother starting idealistic wars. True. The danger with Donald Trump is he might also be the one who creates sort of the war to end all wars by pressing the nuclear button at some point. So he's a bit erratic,
because he might just feel like it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but he definitely does.
He might just feel like it one day.
He definitely does lean into conservative isolationism. I think that's sort of like a tradition he actively flirts with. I'll have to keep this one on the back burner. I want to. I think this distinction between sort of neoconservative conservatives and traditional conservatives definitely exists in ideology. I'm trying to work out if it does really exist in practice as well.